Thank you, David. Why don't you just keep talking and I'll sit and drink in your words. They were lovely. It's lovely to be back here. First time since my last book, as David got across. Carla and Barbara were always very welcoming to me. And I have to tell you, publishers and authors scratch and crawl and do all sorts of things to be able to speak at this marvelous place. But they always said, when's your next book? You're on. And it was lovely. And as David said, Brad and Lissa have carried on the wondrous tradition that Carla began, the energy and the ingenuity, and may it keep going. The fact that all of you have come tonight is a testimony to the job they do and the reverence for books that we all share. Richard Nixon's a hard man to let go of. I remember as a child in black and white fuzzy television seeing this odd man. He was on the ticket with General Eisenhower, and there was some problem of his taking some money from a secret fund. He was talking about his daughter's dog, and I thought, he's interesting. Well, he never stopped being interesting. Richard Nixon was never boring. And as David mentioned, he was probably as interesting in his after presidency as he was during his presidency. I chronicle in the book the beginning with Spiro Agnew. Remember Spiro Agnew being in some trouble. And I had said to my editor at the New Yorker, the very lamented and very justly legendary William Shawn, had said to me, so what are you thinking of writing next? And I said, well, I don't know. I just have this feeling that we're going to change vice presidents and presidents within a year. This was Labor Day of '73. It was a very way out there, kind of wild thought at the time. And so we agreed I would write a journal, not a diary, but watch the events and interpret them and talk about them. And we didn't know where it was going. And as he said at the time, we don't know how to change vice presidents, because that would be the first order of business. We didn't know how to do anything. We didn't know how to change vice presidents. We didn't know how to impeach a president. We didn't know how to get another president. It was all kind of made up as we went along. And one of the most distressing things about now is the loose way in which this word impeachment is tossed around. And I may or may not get to this later because I have so much to talk about. But if there is such a thing, the way that Richard Nixon was almost impeached was really the model. It came from the center. It was bipartisan. It was, the country could accept it because it was arrived at in a very fair and methodical way. So Richard Nixon had no choice, finally, but to resign. He held out and he held out, but mainly Republican senators went to see him. They didn't want to conduct a trial. They just wanted to get this thing over with, and they wanted Jerry Ford in there before the election. So we had this iconic Nixon goodbye as he got onto the helicopter to take him to the plane to go to San Clemente, his western White House, where he would retire and never be heard from again. So we thought, well, that's not my Nixon. He was, when he got to California, he was understandably deeply, deeply depressed. He had worked for decades to get to this highest place that he possibly could, than anybody in this country possibly can, in this country politically, and it all gone smash. He kind of knew in his own head he'd done a fair amount to bring it on. But he always believed that people were out to get him. This was what really brought about his downfall. He could not distinguish between opponents and enemies. And this became a big problem for him. But he was depressed. He was not well. He had phlebitis from a trip to the Middle East that he took toward the end. But he was not going to give up. He had never given up all his life. He'd always seen himself as being treated as lesser and lower than others. He was poor. His family was, let's just say just dysfunctional was not a word then, but this was a really dysfunctional family. But usually they don't grow up to tear up the Constitution. But he had been looked down as a kid. He was awkward. He read a lot. He was not popular. He never really had friends. Strange kind of person to go into politics, but he was just so determined about everything. So he was determined this was not going to be the end of Richard Nixon. No, no. He was going to work his way back into respectability. Now imagine, this was a situation which would have crushed most people. And yet he was determined. So he drew up a plan. They always had a plan. A number of aides were sent out to California with him at the government expense. And they drew up a plan called Wizard. And this was to be the resurgence and reemergence of Richard Nixon as a statesman. Now, he was smart enough to know that how do you get to be a statesman? Well, people listen to you. They're going to listen to you on foreign policy, not on, frankly, education or environment or these things. And also, those issues bored him anyway. His great triumphs were détente with the Soviet Union and the opening to China. China was really the one dearest to his heart. So he began to make speeches. He began to take trips. He went to China and he issued pronouncements as if he were still president, or he thought he was. He would, our Nixon never quite, he didn't change though. He would write a secret memorandum to the president on his trip or on some issue, and then he, of course, leak it to the press, and it would be in the papers. And he had the interviews, the famous interviews with David Frost, which were not as portrayed in Frost-Nixon. You can look it up. I take that apart pretty well. He did not confess. They just left out a few words that were inconvenient to the story. He then began to get bored in San Clemente, moved to New York, where he'd been before, after he'd lost the California governorship, after he'd lost the presidency in 1960, when everybody thought, oh, he's gone. But he's never gone. I wish he were back now, because he was so much fun. And so interesting. In any event, he moved to New York, and he and Pat Nixon, she was thrilled to be out of politics at last. She hated it. And they bought a brownstone. They were vetoed at various co-ops, of course. And he decided he would have a series of dinners with the poobahs of New York, publishers, bankers, the Council on Foreign Relations, whatever, almost all stag. Well, these dinners I discovered this was just in the last few years. I discovered this post-presidency, which I found as interesting as the presidency. So he would have these dinners, and everything was clockwork. At 7 o'clock, he met people at the front door. They went upstairs. He mixed drinks. He really prided himself on the dry martinis that he made. Now, this was not a man who was very good at small talk, but they chatted away. He had a house, and the subtlety was not his long suit. The house was done up in Chinese decor. The appetizers were Chinese. The waiters were Chinese. The dinner was Chinese. And then after dinner, they would go upstairs, and there was an organized subject at the dinner, and then afterwards they would go upstairs, and there would be some more chat. And Nixon, that card, he would look up at 10:30. He'd look up at a clock, and he'd say, "Oh, it's 10:30, and I promised I would get David Cohen to a house of prostitution by 11, so we have to stop now." And everybody knew to leave. But the word of these dinners went all over New York, and everybody wanted to come. He became a celebrity. After a while, he thought New York he didn't like the atmosphere for his grandchildren, on whom he doted. And so he moved to Saddle River, New Jersey. But he wasn't finished. There was another generation to cultivate. So he had a series of dinners in Saddle River where he would, Roger Stone, you may have read about, but he was his operative for this. They invited journalists too young to have been of age during Watergate. Nobody who knew about Watergate was to be around. And he could be very impressive. He spoke just with a microphone, not even a note. And he was kind of name-droppy about foreign leaders I have known, but everybody was very impressed. And so in the end, he won on his own terms.